He called me, too poor, to sit with his rich in-laws. But they secretly invited me to dinner without him. What happened that night left my son speechless. A shocking family secret, an unexpected alliance, and a revenge no one saw coming. The morning my son told me I was too poor to meet his rich in-laws, I smiled as though his words hadn't pierced straight through my heart. At 68 years old, I had learned that some wounds were too deep to show. My name is Samuel Carter. I spent 42 years working as a carpenter in a small Ohio town. My hands were rough, my back was bent, and my clothes were old enough to tell stories of their own. Every wrinkle on my face had been earned honestly. After my wife, Mary, passed away 12 years earlier, my entire world became our only son, Daniel. Everything I had belonged to him. I worked overtime so he could attend college. I skipped meals so he could buy textbooks. I sold my old pickup truck to pay his final semester's tuition. I never complained because every parent dreams of seeing their child live a better life. Daniel did exactly that. He became a successful corporate lawyer in Chicago. A few years later, he fell in love with Victoria Langston, the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the city. Their engagement appeared in local newspapers. Pictures of expensive vacations, luxury parties, and elegant dinners flooded social media. Whenever neighbors asked if I was proud, I always answered with a smile. I've never been richer than having a son who chased his dreams. I believed those words, until the afternoon everything changed. Daniel had driven 3 hours to visit me. I thought he wanted to spend time together. Instead, he sat stiffly in my tiny living room, avoiding eye contact. "Dad," he began quietly, "there's something important we need to discuss." I poured 2 cups of coffee. "What is it, son?" He hesitated. Then he looked directly at me. "Victoria's parents are hosting an engagement dinner next Saturday." "That's wonderful. They invited close family." I smiled. "I'll finally get to meet them." His face immediately tightened. "Actually, that's why I'm here." Something in his voice made my stomach sink. "Dad," he rubbed his forehead, "I don't think you should come." For several seconds, I honestly thought he was joking. "What do you mean?" He sighed heavily. "You know how wealthy Victoria's family is. So, they're very particular." I frowned. "About what?" He looked down at my faded work boots. "They expect a certain image." Silence filled the room. Then he finally said the words that changed everything. "I don't want you embarrassing me." My hands froze around the coffee cup. "I'm sorry. You still live here." He glanced around my modest home. "You wear old clothes. You drive that rusty truck." "Dad, they won't understand." I stared at him. "So you're ashamed of me?" "No, you just said you were." "It's not like that." "Then explain." He stood and began pacing. "You don't know these people. They judge everyone. They'll think I came from nothing." His final sentence hit harder than anything else. "I've worked too hard to escape that life." Escape? That life? The life where his mother and I sacrificed everything. The life that paid for every opportunity he ever received. I quietly placed my coffee on the table. "I see. Dad, please don't make this difficult." "I won't." He looked relieved. "Good. I hope the dinner goes well." He smiled. "I knew you'd understand." "Understand? No. I simply realized my son no longer recognized the people who built his future." He hugged me before leaving. His hug lasted barely 3 seconds. As his expensive SUV disappeared down the road, I stood alone on my porch. The house suddenly felt much emptier than it had the day Mary died. That evening, I took out an old photo album. Pictures covered every page. Daniel's first bicycle, his high school graduation, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, Mary smiling proudly beside him. I gently touched one photograph. Mary used to say something whenever Daniel achieved another milestone. "Never let success make him forget where love came from." I whispered to her picture. "I think we failed." The following week passed slowly. I kept myself busy repairing neighbors' fences and building small furniture in my workshop. By Friday evening, I had almost convinced myself I'd accepted Daniel's decision. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Chicago number. "Hello," a calm female voice answered. "May I speak with Mr. Samuel Carter?" "Speaking. My name is Eleanor Langston." The name immediately caught my attention. Victoria's mother. For a moment, I couldn't speak. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No. Not at all." She paused. "I recently learned something that deeply upset me." "What would that be?" "I discovered Daniel told you not to attend tomorrow's family dinner." I stayed silent. I wanted to apologize. "There's no need. There absolutely is. I could hear genuine disappointment in her voice. Mr. Carter, our family invited you personally. My heart skipped. What? We've been looking forward to meeting the man who raised Daniel. He told us you were traveling out of state. I closed my eyes. My own son had lied. Eleanor continued. When Victoria mentioned she'd never met her future father-in-law, I found it rather strange. So I called Daniel. He insisted you were unavailable. But this afternoon, her voice became colder. I learned the truth. I didn't know what to say. She took a slow breath. My husband and I would like to invite you ourselves. I hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea. I respectfully disagree. I'm not sure I belong there. You belong more than anyone. Her words stunned me. Please, come tomorrow. But don't tell Daniel. I blinked. I'm sorry. We'd like it to be a surprise. Why? Because some lessons are best learned face to face. For the first time in days. I felt something I hadn't expected. Curiosity. I had no idea that accepting that invitation would uncover a decades-old family secret, one that would leave my son speechless and change every relationship in that room forever. The next morning, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror longer than I had in years. My closet wasn't filled with designer suits or expensive jackets. Most of my clothes were work shirts stained by sawdust, faded flannel, and old denim jeans. At the back of the closet hung one suit. It was charcoal gray, nearly 15 years old. I'd worn it only twice, once at Mary's funeral and once at Daniel's college graduation. The sleeves were slightly short now, and the fabric had begun to lose its shine, but it was clean and neatly pressed. I smiled faintly. It'll have to do, Mary. Before leaving, I stopped beside the small wooden box that rested on my dresser. Inside was Mary's wedding ring. I held it gently in my palm. You always believed kindness wins in the end, I whispered. Let's hope you're right. Then I slipped the ring back into the box and locked the house. The drive to Chicago took nearly 4 hours. As the city skyline came into view, I couldn't help feeling out of place. Luxury cars surrounded my old pickup truck. Glass towers reflected the afternoon sun. Everything looked polished. Everything except me. The Langston estate stood behind elegant iron gates. It looked more like a private resort than a family home. Perfect gardens stretched across acres of land. A fountain sparkled in the center of the driveway. Luxury cars, worth more than my entire house, lined the entrance. I almost turned around. Then the gate slowly opened. A security guard smiled politely. Mr. Carter. I nodded. We've been expecting you. That surprised me. He directed me toward the front entrance. As I stepped from my truck, I noticed several guests watching. Some glanced at my pickup with obvious curiosity. Others whispered quietly. I simply straightened my shoulders. I had spent my entire life earning an honest living. I had nothing to be ashamed of. Before I could ring the bell, the massive front door swung open. A graceful woman in her 60s stepped outside. Eleanor Langston. She smiled warmly. You must be Samuel. I nodded. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. To my surprise, she hugged me. Not a formal handshake. A genuine hug. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure I should. I'm very glad you did. She stepped aside. My husband has been waiting. Inside, the mansion was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, paintings that looked priceless, but none of it impressed me as much as the kindness in Eleanor's eyes. She led me into a private library. An older gentleman stood beside the fireplace. Tall, silver-haired, perfectly tailored suit. He looked every bit the powerful businessman newspapers loved to photograph. He walked toward me without hesitation. Samuel. He extended his hand. I'm Richard Langston. His handshake was firm. It's an honor to meet the man who raised Daniel. I smiled politely. I don't know about honor. I do. He motioned toward 2 leather chairs. Please sit. Tea had already been prepared. Not once did they make me feel uncomfortable. Not once did they look at my old suit. Instead, they asked about my life. About Mary. About carpentry. About how Daniel had grown up. For nearly an hour we talked like old friends. Eventually Richard leaned back thoughtfully. I have a question. Go ahead. When Daniel told us about his childhood, he paused. He described it as miserable. That hurt. He said he grew up with nothing. I slowly shook my head. We didn't have much money. But he never went hungry. He always had birthday presents, Christmas gifts, a warm bed, 2 parents who loved him. Richard exchanged a quiet glance with Eleanor. We suspected as much. I frowned. What do you mean? Eleanor sighed. Daniel has spent the last 2 years pretending he built himself. He rarely mentions you. He speaks as though he escaped poverty completely alone. Richard nodded. Success is admirable. Forgetting the people who sacrificed for it is not. Silence settled over the room. Finally Richard spoke again. Samuel, I hope you won't misunderstand what I'm about to say. I'm listening. We invited you here today for more than dinner. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Richard stood and walked toward an old cabinet. He removed a worn leather folder. Its edges looked decades old. He placed it gently on the table. I've been waiting 40 years to meet you. I blinked. I'm afraid I don't understand. He slowly opened the folder. Inside were faded photographs, old newspaper clippings, letters. Then he turned one photograph toward me. The moment I saw it, every breath left my body. The picture showed 3 young men standing together at a construction site. One of them was me. I looked no older than 25. Standing beside me was my late wife, Mary. And beside us, a young Richard Langston. I stared at him in disbelief. You, he smiled sadly. Yes, we've met before. My hands began shaking. I don't remember. You wouldn't. It was one summer, 1984. Then, like lightning, the memories came rushing back. A construction accident, scaffolding collapsing, smoke, chaos, a frightened, young engineer trapped beneath steel beams. I had crawled into the wreckage, ignoring everyone's warnings, to pull him out. That engineer had been Richard Langston. You saved my life, Richard said quietly. I searched for you afterward. But you'd already moved away. I never found you. I spent decades hoping I'd have another chance to thank you. Tears filled my eyes. I never even knew your name. Richard smiled. And now fate brings us together. He looked toward the dining room. But neither of us knew. Our children would meet first. At that exact moment, the front door opened. Voices echoed through the mansion. Daniel had arrived. He had no idea his father was already inside. Nor did he know that the wealthy family he wanted to impress had just discovered the truth about the man he had tried so hard to hide. Within minutes, the most unforgettable dinner of his life was about to begin. The sound of laughter drifted through the grand foyer. Daniel had arrived. I could recognize my son's voice anywhere, even after everything that had happened. Richard quietly closed the old leather folder and looked at me. Are you ready? I took a deep breath. I didn't come here to humiliate my son. Richard nodded. I know. But sometimes the truth speaks louder than revenge. Before I could answer, Eleanor gently touched my arm. Whatever happens tonight, you're not alone. Those simple words carried more warmth than anything Daniel had said to me in years. A few moments later, a house attendant stepped into the library. Sir, everyone is seated. Richard smiled. Perfect. He looked at me. Let's join them. The dining room looked like something from a movie. A crystal chandelier stretched across the ceiling. A table large enough for 20 guests was decorated with white roses, silver candles, and sparkling crystal glasses. Executives, doctors, business partners, close family friends, nearly everyone wore expensive designer clothing. Conversations filled the room until Richard entered. Everyone stood respectfully. Then they noticed me. For a brief second, silence. Some guests looked confused, others smiled politely. Then Daniel turned around. The color drained from his face. Dad, his voice barely escaped his lips. He looked from me, to Richard, then to Eleanor. His confident smile disappeared instantly. What are you doing here? Before I could answer, Eleanor spoke calmly. We invited your father. Daniel forced a nervous laugh. There must be some misunderstanding. There isn't, Richard replied. You told us your father was out of town. Another silence. Daniel swallowed hard. You lied, Eleanor said gently, but firmly. Victoria looked completely confused. Daniel, you told me your father couldn't travel. He avoided her eyes. I was trying to. He couldn't finish the sentence. Richard pulled out the chair beside him. Samuel, would you honor us by sitting here? Not at the end of the table. Not hidden in a corner. At the head table, right beside the host. Gasps echoed through the room. Daniel stared in disbelief. His father, the man he had called an embarrassment, was being treated as the guest of honor. I quietly took my seat. Daniel remained standing. Richard looked at him. Aren't you joining us? He slowly sat down, directly across from me. For the first time since he was a little boy, he couldn't look me in the eyes. Dinner began. The first few minutes were painfully quiet. Guests spoke politely about business, travel, and upcoming weddings. Daniel hardly touched his food. Victoria kept glancing between us, sensing something was terribly wrong. Finally, she broke the silence. Mr. Carter. I smiled. Please call me Samuel. She nodded. Samuel. Daniel always told me you worked with wood. I did. For over 40 years. What kind of carpenter? I built houses, schools, churches, sometimes furniture. Her eyes widened. That's incredible. I shrugged. Just honest work. Richard smiled knowingly. Honest work builds the world. Several guests nodded. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. One businessman leaned toward me. So you're retired now? Mostly. I still help neighbors when they need repairs. Richard laughed. I've seen Samuel's craftsmanship. It lasts longer than most modern buildings. Daniel looked surprised. You've seen his work? Richard smiled mysteriously, in a manner of speaking. As dessert was served, Richard gently tapped his glass. The room became silent. I'd like to say a few words before tonight ends. Everyone listened. This dinner was arranged to celebrate Daniel and Victoria's future together. Polite applause followed. But today, he looked toward me. I also discovered something extraordinary. Daniel stiffened. Richard continued. Many years ago, before my company ever existed. I was a young engineer working on my first construction project. His voice grew softer. A terrible accident trapped me beneath collapsing steel. Guests listened intently. The doctors later told me I should have died that day. Richard smiled toward me, but one man ignored every warning. He crawled into the wreckage. He risked his own life to save mine. Every eye slowly turned toward me. Daniel frowned. Richard continued. I searched for that man for decades. I never found him. Until yesterday. The room fell completely silent. Richard raised his glass. That man is Samuel Carter. For a moment, no one moved. Then applause filled the room. Some guests even stood. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. You saved my father's life. I nodded awkwardly. I only did what anyone should do. Richard smiled. No, most people ran away. You ran toward danger. Daniel looked completely frozen. He had spent years hiding the man he believed was ordinary. Now everyone in the room was honoring him as a hero. But Richard wasn't finished. He looked directly at Daniel. Success should never erase gratitude. His words echoed through the silent dining room. A person's wealth is measured by character, not by the size of a bank account. Daniel lowered his head. No one defended him. No one spoke. The truth was heavier than any argument. Then Richard picked up the old leather folder. I have one more thing to share. He slowly removed a faded document. I've kept this for over 40 years. He placed it in front of me. I stared at the paper, and my hands began to tremble. It was a handwritten promise I had completely forgotten. A promise Richard had written the day I saved his life. One sentence was underlined. If I ever find the man who saved me, I will repay that debt, not with money, but with loyalty for the rest of my life. The room was silent again. Daniel looked from the paper to me, then back to Richard. He finally realized this dinner had never been about money. It was about the value of a man he had spent years trying to hide. And the biggest surprise of the night was still waiting. For several long seconds, no one said a word. The only sound in the dining room was the soft clink of silverware as a waiter quietly cleared the dessert plates. Every guest seemed frozen, still trying to process what Richard had revealed. Daniel looked pale. His confident smile, the one he wore in every business magazine and social media post, had completely disappeared. He stared at the old handwritten letter lying in front of me as if it were evidence in a courtroom. Victoria slowly reached for his hand. He didn't notice. His eyes never left me. Richard folded the letter carefully and looked around the room. Some debts, he said calmly, can never truly be repaid. A life cannot be measured in dollars. But gratitude can be measured in actions. He turned toward me. Samuel, I have waited more than 40 years to thank you. I smiled gently. You already have. No, Richard replied. Not yet. He nodded toward one of his assistants standing near the doorway. The young man stepped forward carrying a dark blue leather folder. At first, I assumed it contained company documents. Richard placed it on the table and slid it toward me. I believe this belongs to you. I frowned. I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else. I haven't. Slowly, I opened the folder. Inside were property deeds, legal papers, and a small brass key attached to a wooden tag. I looked up, confused. What is this? Richard smiled. Do you remember the old Carter and Sons furniture workshop on Willow Street? My heart skipped. I remember building it. It closed nearly 20 years ago, I said quietly. The bank took it after the recession. Richard nodded. I know. I swallowed. Why are you asking? Because I bought that building 10 years ago. I blinked. You bought it, yes, but I never did anything with it. He pushed the key closer to me. I was saving it. For whom? For the man who built it. The room erupted in whispers. Daniel looked completely stunned. You mean? I whispered. Richard smiled. The workshop is yours again. I couldn't breathe. That little workshop had been my dream. Mary and I had built it together, board by board. After she passed away and business declined, losing it had broken my heart. I had never told Daniel how much it hurt. He had been too busy starting his new life. My fingers trembled as I picked up the old brass key. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Tears blurred my vision. I don't know what to say. Richard's voice softened. Say you'll unlock the doors again. Across the table, Daniel lowered his head in shame. The room burst into applause. Not because of money, not because of wealth, but because a man was being given back a piece of his life. Then Victoria stood. She walked around the table until she was standing beside me. With tears in her eyes, she said, Samuel, I owe you an apology. I looked at her in surprise. You've done nothing wrong. I believed everything Daniel told me about his childhood. She glanced at him sadly. I thought he had no family who cared about him. Her voice broke. I never imagined he had a father like you. She hugged me. A real, heartfelt hug. I hope you'll still allow me to call you family someday. I smiled. I'd like that very much. Daniel finally stood. His chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Dad, his voice cracked. I'm sorry. Every eye turned toward him. I was ashamed of where I came from. He wiped away a tear. But tonight I realized, I should have been proud. I looked at him quietly. Years of disappointment couldn't disappear in a single sentence. But for the first time in a long while, his apology sounded genuine. Before I could respond, Richard spoke once more. Daniel, apologizing is the first step. He paused. Earning forgiveness is the second. Daniel nodded silently. He understood. As the evening came to an end, the guests slowly began leaving the mansion. Many stopped to shake my hand. Several thanked me for saving Richard's life decades ago. Others complimented my years of honest work. The same people Daniel feared would judge me, respected me the most. When I finally stepped outside, the cool night air felt different. Lighter. Behind me, I heard footsteps. It was Daniel. He stood beside my old pickup truck, staring at the faded paint. I used to love riding in this truck, he said quietly. I smiled faintly. You used to call it the Blue Rocket. He laughed through his tears. I remember. There was a long silence. Then he looked at me. Dad, if you'll let me, I'd like to help rebuild the workshop. I looked into his eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't see a successful lawyer. I saw the little boy who used to hand me nails while I built furniture. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of our story. It was the beginning of rebuilding something far more valuable than an old workshop. It was the beginning of rebuilding a family. The drive back to Ohio was quieter than any trip I had taken in years. The brass key Richard had given me rested in my shirt pocket. Every few miles, I reached over to make sure it was still there. It wasn't the key itself that mattered. It was what it represented. A second chance. When I reached my small house, the porch light illuminated the empty rocking chair where Mary used to spend summer evenings. I sat there for a long time, looking up at the stars. I wish you had been there, I whispered. You would have smiled. The next morning, I drove to Willow Street. The old workshop came into view at the end of the block. Time had not been kind to it. The paint had faded. Several windows were broken. Weeds had pushed through cracks in the concrete. The old wooden sign reading, Carter and Sons Furniture, hung crookedly by a single chain. I stepped out of my truck and unlocked the front door with the brass key. The lock clicked open as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, dust covered everything. Old workbenches stood exactly where Mary and I had left them years ago. My worn toolbox still rested in the corner. I ran my hand across the scarred wooden table where Daniel had built his very first birdhouse at the age of 8. I could almost hear his excited voice. Dad, look, I made it myself. A tear rolled down my cheek. So many memories had been trapped inside these walls. I quietly said, I'm home. 3 days later, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. Daniel stepped out. He wasn't wearing a designer suit. Instead, he wore blue jeans, work boots, and an old gray t-shirt. He looked awkward carrying a toolbox. I figured I'd need this, he said with a nervous smile. I looked at him for a moment. You've probably never used it. He laughed. Probably not. For the first hour, we barely spoke. We swept floors, removed broken shelves, opened dusty windows. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It simply reflected the years we had lost. Around lunchtime, Daniel finally stopped working. Dad, I looked up. I lied about more than the dinner. I know. I told people I paid my own college tuition. I remained silent. The truth is, you worked 2 jobs. He swallowed hard. I told everyone I bought my first apartment myself. You sold mom's jewelry. His voice cracked. I even pretended my success started with me. He looked at his hands. But every step I took started with yours. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I placed my hand on his shoulder. You can't change yesterday. No, but you can decide who you'll be tomorrow. He nodded slowly. I want to make things right. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Richard Langston was making plans of his own. At the next board meeting of Langston Industries, he addressed his executives. I've spent 40 years building this company, he said. I've also spent 40 years searching for the man who saved my life. The room listened quietly. I've found him. Several executives smiled politely. Richard continued, from today forward, Carter & Sons Furniture will become our official supplier for handcrafted executive furniture. The room erupted in surprise. One director raised a concern. Sir, that workshop isn't even operating yet. Richard smiled. It will be, and we'll give them every opportunity to succeed. News spread quickly. Within days, local newspapers ran the story. Retired carpenter who saved billionaire's life reopens family workshop after 40 years. Television reporters arrived. Neighbors volunteered to help renovate the building. Former customers returned with old photographs of furniture I had built decades earlier. One elderly woman walked into the workshop carrying a wooden rocking chair. My husband bought this from you in 1989, she said. It still hasn't needed a single repair. I smiled proudly. That's because furniture built with love lasts. Daniel watched the conversation from across the room. He saw complete strangers thanking me, respecting me, honoring me, not because I was rich, because I had lived honestly. That afternoon, he quietly approached me. I spent years chasing respect. He looked around the busy workshop. And you earned it without ever asking. A week later, Victoria visited. She carried a large photo frame wrapped in brown paper. I brought something, she said. When I unwrapped it, I froze. It was an enlarged photograph from Daniel's college graduation. In the original picture, only Daniel had been framed. But Victoria had found the full version. There stood Mary and me on either side of him. Proud, smiling, together. This belongs here, she whispered. We hung it above the workshop entrance. Every customer who walked inside would now see the real foundation of Carter & Sons. Not money, not success, family. As the sun set that evening, I stood outside the workshop beside Daniel. The old sign had been cleaned and restored. Fresh paint covered the walls. Lights glowed warmly through the windows. For the first time in decades, the building felt alive again. Daniel looked at me and smiled. Dad, thank you for not giving up on me. I looked toward the glowing workshop. I never gave up. I was just waiting for you to find your way home. Neither of us noticed that, across the street, a black luxury sedan had quietly pulled over. Inside sat a middle-aged man holding an old photograph. He stared at me through the windshield, his expression filled with disbelief. Then he whispered to himself. It can't be. He reached for his phone. If Samuel Carter is alive, then everything my family believed for 35 years is a lie. The biggest family secret had not yet been revealed. The following morning, I unlocked the workshop just before sunrise. The smell of fresh-cut oak filled the air. For the first time in decades, the old machines hummed with life again. Volunteers had helped repair the roof, repaint the walls, and restore the workbenches. Orders were already beginning to arrive thanks to Richard Langston's announcement. I never imagined my quiet retirement would become the busiest season of my life. As I switched on the lights, I noticed a black luxury sedan parked across the street. The same one from the night before. A man in his early 60s stepped out. He wore an expensive navy suit, but his face looked tired, almost nervous. He didn't enter immediately. Instead, he stood outside reading the wooden sign. Carter & Sons Furniture. After nearly a minute, he finally walked in. Excuse me, I looked up from the workbench. Can I help you? He studied my face carefully. His eyes suddenly filled with emotion. Your name is Samuel Carter? Yes. He slowly reached into his briefcase and removed an old, faded photograph. I need you to look at this. I wiped my hands on a cloth and took the picture. It showed 3 young construction workers standing beside a half-finished building. I immediately recognized myself. Standing next to me was Mary. But there was someone else. A smiling young man with dark hair. For several seconds, I couldn't remember his name. Then it came rushing back. Michael. The stranger nodded. My father. I looked at him in surprise. You're Michael's son? Yes. My name is Andrew Collins. My heart skipped. I hadn't heard Michael's name in over 35 years. He had been my closest friend when we were young. We worked together, shared meals, dreamed of opening our own construction company. Then one day, he disappeared. I had searched for months. No one knew where he'd gone. What happened to him? I asked quietly. Andrew lowered his eyes. My father died believing you had betrayed him. The words hit me like a hammer. Betrayed him? He thought you stole something from him. I stared at him. What are you talking about? Andrew opened another folder. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1985. The headline read, "Local construction partners split after missing investment fund." I felt my stomach tighten. I remembered the story. A large cash investment meant to start our company had vanished. Rumors spread quickly. People whispered that one of us had taken the money. Michael disappeared before we could ever speak. I didn't take a single dollar, I said firmly. Andrew nodded. I know. You do. My father found evidence just before he died. He slowly placed a sealed envelope on the table. He wrote this letter 2 weeks before his passing. My hands trembled as I opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably Michael's. Sam, if this letter ever reaches you, I need you to know something. You never betrayed me. I was too proud to listen when you tried to explain. Years later, I discovered the truth. The money wasn't stolen by you. It was taken by the accountant we trusted. By the time I learned the truth, I was too ashamed to face you. Please forgive me, your friend, Michael. I couldn't hold back my tears. 35 years. 35 years of believing my best friend hated me. Andrew's voice shook. My father regretted it every day. I folded the letter carefully. I wish he had told me. So do I. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Andrew smiled faintly. My father left me one final request. What was it? He wanted me to find you. And finish the dream you started together. I looked at him in confusion. Andrew slid another document across the workbench. It was a business proposal. My family owns a hardwood mill. We've been supplying furniture companies for years. He looked around the workshop. I'd like our families to work together. I smiled. So the dream finally lives on. Andrew extended his hand. For our fathers. I shook it firmly. For our families. Just then, Daniel walked into the workshop carrying coffee. He stopped when he saw Andrew. Am I interrupting? I smiled. No, son, you've arrived just in time. Daniel listened as I explained everything. When I finished, he looked at Andrew and said quietly, my father deserved loyal friends. Andrew nodded, and now he has one again. Outside, the workshop buzzed with activity. Inside, an old wound that had remained open for 35 years had finally begun to heal. But neither of us knew that the accountant who had destroyed 2 families' friendship all those years ago was still alive, and when he saw Samuel Carter's name back in the newspapers, he realized the truth he had buried for decades was about to come back and destroy everything he had built. 3 days after Andrew Collins visited the workshop, life seemed almost peaceful. Orders continued pouring in from across the state. Richard Langston had kept his promise, and Carter & Sons Furniture was now producing handcrafted conference tables, executive desks, and custom cabinets for Langston Industries. The little workshop that had once been abandoned was alive again. The sound of saws, sanders, and laughter filled the building from morning until evening. Daniel had become a familiar sight. Every weekend, he drove from Chicago to Ohio wearing work boots instead of Italian leather shoes. His expensive watch was replaced by a simple pair of safety gloves. One Saturday afternoon, as we finished sanding a walnut dining table, Daniel looked at me. Dad, yes, I've been thinking. I smiled. That usually leads to trouble. He laughed. Probably. Then his face became serious. I want to tell the truth. What truth? Everything. I stopped working. I lied to my friends. I lied to Victoria. I lied to her family. I even lied to myself. He looked around the workshop. I told everyone I built my success alone. But every board in this building reminds me that someone else laid the foundation first. I placed my sander on the bench. So what are you going to do? He took a deep breath. I'm resigning from the partnership track at my law firm. I stared at him. That's a big decision, I know. They offered me more money than I ever imagined. Then why leave? He smiled sadly. Because I finally realized I was chasing titles instead of peace. I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending to be someone I'm not. Before I could respond, the workshop door burst open. Richard Langston walked in with Eleanor and Victoria. They weren't dressed for a business meeting. They were carrying boxes of donuts and coffee. Richard laughed. I heard Saturdays are family workdays now. Daniel smiled. They are. Richard looked around proudly. I've never seen this place so full of life. Then his smile slowly faded. I wish this were only a social visit. Something in his voice immediately caught my attention. What happened? Richard placed a newspaper on the workbench. The headline read, Former Accountant Denies Role in 1985 Missing Investment Case. Below the headline was a photograph of an elderly man. The moment I saw his face, I recognized him. Harold Benson. Andrew, who had arrived only minutes earlier, looked over my shoulder. His expression hardened. That's him. Richard nodded. My legal team started reviewing old company records after Andrew contacted us. What did you find? Daniel asked. Richard looked at him. We found evidence. Real evidence. He opened a thick file filled with financial records. Harold Benson transferred the investment money through 3 different accounts before disappearing. Andrew clenched his fists. So my father was innocent. Richard nodded. And so was Samuel. Daniel looked devastated. My father carried that accusation for decades, without ever defending himself. I smiled quietly. There wasn't much point. The people who mattered already knew my character. Richard looked at me with admiration. Most people would have spent their lives chasing revenge. I shrugged. I spent mine building furniture. Just then, Daniel's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It's my managing partner. He answered. After only 30 seconds, his expression changed. What? He listened silently. Then he hung up. What happened? Victoria asked. Daniel looked at all of us. Harold Benson was arrested this morning. The workshop fell silent. He confessed. Andrew blinked. He confessed. Daniel nodded slowly. The police reopened the case after Richard's investigators submitted the financial records. He admitted stealing every dollar. And he admitted allowing 2 innocent men to blame each other. No one spoke. 35 years of pain. Destroyed by one man's greed. Andrew quietly sat down on an old wooden stool. Tears rolled down his face. My father died thinking he'd lost his best friend. I placed a hand on his shoulder. He knows the truth now. Richard looked at me. So do we. That evening, the entire group gathered outside the workshop. The sun was setting behind the old building. Daniel walked over carrying a brand new wooden sign. He smiled nervously. I made this. It wasn't perfect. The edges were uneven. The lettering was slightly crooked. But I could tell he'd built it with his own hands. Together, we hung it beneath the original workshop sign. It read, Built with integrity, passed down with love. Everyone applauded. Victoria slipped her hand into Daniel's. This, she whispered, is the man I wanted to marry. Daniel looked at me. I spent years trying to escape my past. He smiled through tears. Now it's the part of my life I'm most proud of. As darkness settled over Willow Street, I looked at the workshop glowing with warm light. For the first time in decades, my heart felt completely at peace. But one final surprise still awaited us. A surprise that would bring every family together, and give this story the ending none of us could have imagined. A month passed, and Carter & Sons furniture became busier than anyone could have imagined. Orders arrived from across the country. Business magazines called it the comeback no one saw coming. Local newspapers wrote about the retired carpenter who had rebuilt not only a workshop but also his family. Yet the greatest change wasn't the success. It was Daniel. Every Friday evening, without fail, he drove to Ohio. Instead of spending weekends at luxury clubs or business events, he spent them sweeping floors, polishing furniture, and learning the craft he had ignored for years. One Saturday morning, he handed me a small wooden box. I made this. I opened it carefully. Inside was Mary's old wedding ring. I looked up in surprise. I found it while cleaning your bedroom last week, he said softly. I built this box to keep it safe. The workmanship wasn't perfect. The corners were slightly uneven. The finish wasn't as smooth as mine would have been. But it was beautiful, because it was made with love. I smiled. Your mother would have treasured this. Daniel lowered his head. I wish I had thanked her more. So do I whispered. A few days later, Richard Langston invited everyone to his estate once again. This time, there were no secrets. No lies. No hidden invitations, only family. As we entered the grand dining room, I noticed something different. The chair at the head of the table was empty. Richard smiled. Samuel. He pointed toward it. Tonight, that's your seat. I shook my head. It should be yours. He laughed. I've sat there for 30 years. It's someone else's turn. The room applauded as I reluctantly took the seat. Daniel sat beside me, not across from me, beside me, a quiet gesture that meant more than words. After dinner, Richard stood and tapped his glass. I have an announcement. The room fell silent. When I first met Samuel again, I wanted to repay a debt. He smiled, but I realized something. No amount of money could ever repay the man who saved my life. He turned toward me. So I've decided not to repay it. Everyone looked confused. Richard continued. Instead, I'd like to honor it. 2 attendants rolled in a covered display. They removed the cloth. The room gasped. It was a magnificent handcrafted conference table. Nearly 20 feet long, made from solid American walnut. Every inch had been carved by hand. At its center was a brass plaque. It read, "Integrity is the greatest legacy." Richard looked proudly at the guests. This table will remain in the boardroom of Langston Industries. And every major decision this company makes will be made around something built by Samuel Carter and his family. Applause filled the room. Daniel quietly wiped away a tear. Victoria squeezed his hand. Then she stood. I have an announcement too. She smiled nervously. Daniel and I have decided to postpone the wedding. A murmur spread through the guests. Daniel nodded. Not because we're unhappy, but because we want to earn our marriage. Victoria continued. We're going to spend the next 6 months volunteering together, rebuilding homes for families who can't afford repairs. She looked at me. Your life reminded us that success means nothing if it isn't shared. Richard smiled proudly. Now that's a marriage worth celebrating. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Daniel and I sat on the mansion's back porch. The stars filled the sky. It reminded me of nights at my little house in Ohio. Dad, yes, I keep thinking about the day I told you not to come to dinner. I stayed silent. I don't expect you to forget it. I won't. He nodded sadly. But, I smiled, I don't want to remember you for your worst day. He looked at me. I'd rather remember the little boy who believed I could fix anything. Daniel laughed through his tears. You always could. I shook my head. No, not everything, but relationships. They can usually be repaired. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders. For the first time since he was a child, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Sometimes silence says what words never can. As we watched the sunrise begin to color the horizon, I realized something. The richest moment of my life wasn't when Richard returned my workshop. It wasn't when newspapers called me a hero. It wasn't when business success returned. It was this simple moment. Sitting beside my son, finally feeling like I had him back. But one final chapter remained. A chapter that would bring the entire journey to its unforgettable conclusion. 6 months passed faster than any of us expected. The promise Daniel and Victoria had made was not just for show. Every weekend, they traveled to small towns across Ohio and Illinois, helping repair homes for elderly couples, veterans, and struggling families. Sometimes they painted walls. Sometimes they rebuilt porches. Sometimes they simply listened to people who hadn't had visitors in years. Daniel never spoke about his career anymore. Instead, he talked about people. One afternoon, while we were replacing the roof on an elderly widow's house, she smiled at Daniel. You remind me of your father. Daniel looked at me, then back at her. I hope one day that's true. I didn't say anything, but my heart was full. Back at the workshop, business had grown beyond anything I had imagined. We had hired 8 local craftsmen. 3 apprentices from the community college joined us to learn traditional woodworking. Andrew Collins supplied the finest hardwood from his family's mill, honoring the dream his father and I had once shared. Every Friday morning, the team gathered before work. Not for a business meeting. For breakfast. We laughed, shared stories, celebrated birthdays. The workshop wasn't just a company anymore. It was a family. One crisp autumn afternoon, Richard Langston arrived carrying a large envelope. I have one last surprise, he said with a grin. I laughed. You've already surprised me enough. I don't think so. He handed me the envelope. Inside was an official invitation. At the top, in elegant gold lettering, it read, The Ohio Governor's Award for Community Legacy. I frowned. What is this? Richard smiled. You've been nominated. I didn't apply. I know. The people you helped did. Attached were dozens of handwritten letters. One from the widow whose roof we'd repaired. One from a veteran whose wheelchair ramp we'd built. One from a young carpenter who wrote. Mr. Carter didn't just teach me how to build furniture. He taught me how to become a man of integrity. My eyes filled with tears. Daniel quietly stood beside me. He had read the letters too. I used to think success meant having your name in magazines, he whispered. He looked at the stack of letters. I was wrong. This is what a real legacy looks like. A month later, the awards ceremony took place. The grand ballroom was filled with business leaders, teachers, firefighters, volunteers, and community members. When my name was announced, the audience stood. I walked slowly to the stage, feeling completely out of place. The governor handed me a plaque, then asked, Mr. Carter, would you like to say a few words? I looked across the room. Richard smiled proudly. Eleanor nodded. Andrew gave me a thumbs up. Victoria held Daniel's hand. And Daniel, he looked at me with the same admiration I used to see in his eyes when he was 10 years old. I stepped to the microphone. I've spent my whole life building things. A gentle laugh spread through the audience. Houses, tables, chairs. But I've learned something. The strongest things we build can't be made from wood. The room fell silent. They're built with honesty, with forgiveness, and with love. I paused. If you ever have to choose between being rich or being remembered with kindness, choose kindness. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. As I walked off the stage, Daniel embraced me. I'm proud to be your son. For the first time in many years, I believed him. Later that evening, as we returned to the workshop, I noticed workers hanging a new plaque beside the entrance. It read, Samuel Carter Community Workshop. Below it were smaller words, open to anyone willing to learn, work honestly, and help others. I smiled. The workshop had become more than a business. It had become a place where people could build a better future. Daniel stood beside me. Dad, I've been thinking about something. What is it? I want my children to know this place. I smiled. They will. They'll know exactly where they came from. As the lights inside the workshop glowed warmly against the evening sky, I realized there was only one final chapter left. One last lesson, one last family gathering, and one ending that would bring every piece of this journey together. 5 years passed. Sometimes life changes so slowly that you don't notice the miracle happening around you. Other times, you wake up one morning and realize everything you once prayed for has already arrived. The Carter and Sons workshop was no longer a small abandoned building on Willow Street. It had become a place where generations worked together. Young people came to learn traditional craftsmanship. Older workers found purpose after retirement. Families came to order furniture, but many stayed just to hear the stories behind every piece. And above the entrance remained the words, integrity is the greatest legacy. Those words became more than a slogan. They became the rule everyone followed. Daniel's life had changed completely. He was still a successful lawyer, but he no longer measured success by expensive cars, luxury offices, or the opinions of wealthy people. He had become a different man, a better man. Every morning, before going to work, he visited the workshop. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. One afternoon, he brought his young daughter, Lily, to meet me. She ran through the workshop excitedly. Grandpa, is it true you built all these things? I laughed. Not all of them. She looked confused. Then who did? I pointed toward Daniel. Your father helped build many of them. She looked at Daniel in surprise. Dad knows how to build furniture. Daniel smiled. Your grandfather taught me. Lily looked around the workshop. So this is where our family started? I nodded. Yes. She smiled. I like it here. Those simple words meant everything. Because I knew she would grow up knowing the truth. Not the version of the story Daniel once told. The real one. One evening, the entire family gathered at the workshop. Richard and Eleanor arrived. Andrew came with his wife and children. Victoria brought a homemade dessert. The same people who had once seemed like strangers were now family. We sat around the old wooden table I built decades ago. The table that had survived countless memories. Richard raised his glass. I think we should remember something tonight. Everyone looked at him. 5 years ago, this family came together because of one dinner. He smiled at me. A dinner that almost didn't happen. Everyone laughed. Daniel lowered his head. I still regret that day. I looked at him. Do you? Yes. I lost years trying to impress people who didn't matter. He looked around the table. And I almost lost the people who mattered most. The room became quiet. Victoria held his hand. Richard nodded. Sometimes people have to lose their way before they understand where home is. Later that night, Daniel and I stood outside the workshop. The same place where years earlier he had admitted his mistakes. The moonlight covered the old building. Dad, yes, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you forgive me? I looked at him. He expected a complicated answer. But the truth was simple. Because I was your father before you disappointed me. Daniel looked away. I don't deserve that. Maybe not. He looked back at me. But forgiveness isn't always about what someone deserves. It's about what kind of person you choose to be. He smiled. You sound like Mom. I laughed softly. I learned from her. The next morning, I unlocked the workshop early. But something was different. On my workbench sat a small package. There was a note attached. For Dad. I opened it. Inside was a beautiful wooden frame. Within it was a photograph from that unforgettable dinner 5 years earlier. But someone had changed the picture. In the original photo, I was standing alone at one side of the table. Now, the entire family had been added around me. Daniel, Victoria, Richard, Eleanor, Andrew, everyone. Below the picture were words carved into the wood. The man we once underestimated became the foundation we all stood upon. I touched the carving gently. My eyes filled with tears. Not because of what I had gained, but because of what had been restored. People often think wealth is measured by houses, cars, and bank accounts. But I learned something different. A rich man can lose everything. A poor man can have everything. Because true wealth is not what you own. It's who stands beside you when life tests you. That night when my son called me, too poor, to sit with his rich in-laws. He thought he was protecting his image. He thought money determined a person's value. But he didn't realize something important. The man he was ashamed of was the same man who built his future. The same hands he wanted to hide were the hands that lifted him when he couldn't stand. And the biggest revenge I ever had wasn't making him regret his words. It wasn't proving I was better. It was watching my son finally understand the truth. A person's greatest treasure isn't the wealth they leave behind. It's the love and respect they earn while they are alive.